Every winter since 1974, it comes down. I've never told a soul until now, until this recording, that I'm not even sure anyone will ever hear. For 49 years, I have been the sole witness to a silent pilgrimage that defies every law of biology and reason I was ever taught. But this is the year the pilgrimage became a plea, and my silence became a choice I could no longer afford to make. So listen closely. I'm going to tell you everything. I'm going to tell you why they brave the death zone of the high Himalayas, what they leave behind on the ice for me, and why this year, after a half-century of watching, I finally broke the one rule that kept me safe. I'm going to tell you the truth about the sky above Sagarmatha, and the secret frozen in its heart. I need someone to know what I saw. I need someone to understand the cost of their long wait, and the price of my final decision. This is my confession. My name is, or was, Dr. Eris Thorne, a climatologist. It was a name that used to open doors in academic circles, a name attached to respected papers on glacial dynamics and atmospheric science. That was before the scandal, before the lie. Now, it just means this cabin, this mountain, and this silence. My credibility, the only thing I have left, is this place. I'm broadcasting, if you can call it that, from a location that is both very real and completely off the map. I am in Nepal's Sagarmatha National Park, but miles from any established trekking route, in a small, reinforced cabin I inherited decades ago. Officially, it serves as a private, high-altitude weather station for a university that has long since forgotten my existence. My funding dried up 20 years ago, but the mountain provides, and I remain. This place, this verifiable, unforgiving geography, is the foundation of my story. It's the one thing you can check. My life up here is a ritual, a carefully measured dance with entropy. Every morning begins with the scrape of a metal shovel against new snow, just to clear the door. Then, checking the gauges, barometric pressure, temperature, wind speed. The numbers are a kind of prayer, a familiar language in the overwhelming quiet. Conserving kerosene is the main business of the day, a constant calculation of warmth versus longevity. And then there is the listening. You learn to listen differently up here. You listen to the deep, groaning shift of the Khumbu Glacier miles below. You listen to the wind as it scours the ice off the face of what I call Prayer Flag Peak. It's a sound like tearing silk, a constant, high-pitched reminder of how thin the air is, of how fragile everything becomes above 20,000 feet. Up here, survival is a matter of paying attention to the small sounds. That's how I first knew something was wrong. The great wound of my life, the reason I am here, is a lie. A single, catastrophic lie I told over 20 years ago. I falsified a section of climate data to protect the legacy of my mentor, Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a brilliant man, a visionary, but in his later years he became obsessed. He was convinced our planet had been visited, that an anomalous meteorite he'd found in this very region was not of this Earth. He was ridiculed, his reputation shattered. I tried to salvage his climate work, to preserve the part of him that was still sane, by tweaking the numbers on an unrelated study. But a lie is a parasite. It was discovered. My career ended overnight. My wife, unable to bear the public shame and my private obsession, left this cabin. His old research outpost was all he left me. I came here not to hide, but to do penance. Exiled to this beautiful, empty prison of my own making. For 49 years, the mountain had a single, unspoken rule that governed my winter. The rule was simple. I watch, it passes. Every year, sometime after the first heavy snowfall of December, it would appear. A huge, solitary shape, dark against the endless white. It moved, with a slow, deliberate purpose. A silent pilgrimage across the high saddles west of my cabin. I never tried to get closer. I never tried to interact. My role was to be a ghost in my own home, a passive observer to a mystery I learned not to question. My penance was to watch, not to understand. It was a fragile truce. The creature was a feature of the landscape, as predictable and as unknowable as the winter monsoon. I recorded its passage in my logbook, a single, coded entry each year. And that was all. It was a secret I kept from the world, and in a way, I kept it from myself too. But this year, the silence broke. It started not with a sound, but with the absence of one, a stillness that had weight. I was at my small window, looking through the spotting scope, tracking the usual path. The first heavy snows had come a week prior. It was time, pauser, and then I heard it. The familiar, deep crunch of immense weight on powder snow. The sound of its footsteps, but there was something else woven into it. A lighter, faster sound. A frantic, almost playful shuffling. And beneath that, a low, guttural chuffing. It was a sound I had never heard in all my years. A sound that did not belong to the lonely, monolithic figure I knew. My heart began to pound against my ribs. A frantic drum in the thin, cold air. The rhythm of my entire existence was breaking, right there, on the edge of the clearing. Through the powerful lens of my spotting scope, under the cold, clinical blue light of a near-full moon, I saw it. The shape was the same, massive and stooped, covered in what looked like thick, white-grey fur that blended with the snow-dusted rock. It was immense, a creature of impossible scale and power, but it was not alone. Huddled against its massive, furred legs, tucked away from the wind, were two other shapes. They were perfect, smaller versions of the adult. Children. They moved with a twitchy, uncertain energy, tumbling in the deep powder, while the adult stood watch, its great head turning slowly, scanning the ridges. The chuffing sound came from the adult, a low rumble of reassurance. In that moment, the cryptid, the monster, the myth, it all dissolved. It was apparent, and they were, its young, a family. The sight hit me with the force of a physical blow. A family. The word echoed in the empty space of the cabin. In the even emptier space in my chest. For 2 decades, I had been a man utterly alone, a self-imposed exile, paying for a mistake that cost me my own family. My daughter doesn't speak to me. My wife is a ghost in a life I no longer lead. And here, in the most desolate place on earth, was a family that by all rights shouldn't exist, displaying a bond I had thrown away. The secret of their existence was no longer a scientific curiosity. The fact of their youth, their vulnerability, became a stone in my own gut. They had something to protect. They had everything to lose. And I was the only one in the world who knew they were here. A lifetime of passive observation had just collided with a duty I didn't know how to carry. What do you do? What do you do when a myth becomes flesh and blood, and looks at you with what you can only describe as intelligence? My entire scientific training screamed at me to document, to measure, to remain detached. But the man inside me, the father I had failed to be, screamed louder. They looked thin. The young ones seemed frail against the vastness of the mountain. I thought of my own carefully rationed supplies. The high-energy nut bars, the canisters of dried apricots, a luxury I allowed myself once a month. It was an insane impulse, a violation of the primary rule of field observation. You do not interfere. You do not contaminate the subject. You do not engage. But they were not a subject. They were a family. And for the first time in 20 years, the choice felt simple. So I acted. My hands were shaking as I pulled on my heavy parka and boots. The cold bit at my face the moment I opened the door. The air was still and sharp as glass. I took a small, sealed canister of the apricots and 2 bars of nuts and walked out into the moonlight. I didn't go far, just to the large, flat rock at the edge of the clearing, 100 yards from my front door. It felt like a mile. Every step was a betrayal of my 49-year vow of silence. I placed the canister on the cold stone, my breath pluming in front of me. I didn't look back toward the hollow where they were hidden. I simply retreated to my cabin, closed the door, and shot the bolt. The sound echoed with an awful finality. I had broken the first and most important rule. I had made contact, and now I could only wait. I sat there in the dark, the kerosene lamp turned low, listening, just listening. The silence that followed was different. It was charged, filled with a question. Had I just signed their death warrant? Had I made the biggest mistake of my life, even bigger than the lie that sent me here? If you've ever felt the weight of a secret that was too big to carry alone, if you want to know what was waiting on that rock the next morning, then stick with me. Please leave a like on this recording. Subscribe if you haven't. and share this with someone you trust. You need to hear what happened next. Because the pact that began that night, in the shadow of the Himalayas, would demand a price I never could have imagined. And the story is far from over. I slept in fits, a shallow, anxious sleep, filled with the phantom crunch of footsteps and the imagined weight of giant, dark eyes watching me. I half expected to be woken by the sound of my cabin door splintering. But morning came in the usual way, with a slow, grey light seeping over the eastern ridges, turning the snow from blue to a blinding white. It took me an hour to work up the courage to go to the window. My breath fogged the cold glass. I wiped it clear with my sleeve and raised the spotting scope, my heart a cold, heavy knot in my chest. The clearing was empty. The snow around the flat rock was disturbed, tracked with footprints of impossible size, but they were already fading under a light morning wind. The canister was gone. In its place, resting dead center on the stone, was a single, dark object. The distance was too great to make it out clearly. The pact had been acknowledged, the offering accepted. A silent question had been answered with another. I waited until the sun was high, a pale, ineffective disk in the sky. Before I went out, the air was thin and bit at any exposed skin. As I approached the rock, I saw what it was. A single, perfectly smooth, black river stone. It was oblong, fitting neatly into the palm of my hand, and polished by a current that must have flowed here thousands of years ago, before the ice claimed everything. I picked it up. The cold of it was absolute. A deep, ancient cold that felt older than the snow. It wasn't a trade in any human sense of the word. It was a statement, a response. I had offered sustenance, something from my world of warmth and planning. It had offered something from its world of deep time and natural force. That first exchange established the fundamental rule. We would speak across the gulf between us, using the language of objects, of things given and things left behind. I understood then that this was a conversation, and I had only just learned the first word. The ritual had begun. For 2 days, I did nothing. I watched. The family remained sheltered in a deep hollow, a natural amphitheater of rock and ice that was almost invisible from below. I saw the adult leading the young ones on short forays, always turning back before they came too close to the clearing. It was teaching them the boundaries. This area, my area, was to be approached only under specific circumstances. I learned the second rule. All exchanges happen under the cover of darkness or storm. The night was their domain. The rock was the border, a silent embassy between our two separate realities. On the third night, a windstorm howled down from the Tibetan plateau, rattling the corrugated iron of my roof and draping the world in a blinding sheet of blowing snow. It was the perfect cover. I bundled a small oilcloth package with 2 cans of preserved herring and another high-energy bar, and made my way to the rock, fighting against a wind that tried to tear the breath from my lungs. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and dazzlingly bright. The package of fish was gone. In its place, lying on a bed of fresh snow atop the stone, was a fossil. It was a trilobite, a perfect specimen, etched into a flat piece of grey shale. My hands trembled as I picked it up. This was not a random rock. This was an object of profound significance. Trilobites are marine arthropods. Finding one this high in the Himalayas is not unheard of, geologically speaking, as these mountains were once the floor of the Tethys Ocean, but to find one this perfect, this clearly selected, and for it to be left in exchange for food. This was an act of intelligence, of curation. It implied a knowledge of the land that went far beyond mere survival. It knew where to find these things. It knew they were special. The gifts were not payment, they were disclosures. Each one was a page torn from a book I was only just beginning to realize existed. I started a new section in my logbook that night, separate from my meticulous weather data. I called it simply the exchange. I described each item I left and each item I received. The riverstone, I wrote, represented flow, persistence, the power of water over stone. The fossil represented deep time, history, a life that existed before man, before the ice itself. I was a climatologist, a man of science, but I couldn't approach this with scientific detachment. I was interpreting a silent language, My training felt useless. This wasn't about data. It was about meaning. The creature, the parent, wasn't just surviving. It was thinking. It was communicating in the only way it could, with pieces of the mountain itself. The black stone, the grey fossil. It was painting a picture for me of its world, a world of deep, silent, elemental forces. And the first, in return, was showing it a glimpse of mine, a world of processed food, of stored warmth, of forethought. A week later, I left another offering, a pouch of dried milk powder and a small bag of sugar, things I imagined the young ones might need. This time, I made a mistake. As I placed the items on the rock, a flicker of movement in the hollow caught my eye. The adult was watching me. It was only a silhouette against the deeper shadows, a shape that was almost part of the rock face, but I knew it was there. My heart hammered in my throat. I felt a profound sense of having transgressed, of being caught spying. I quickly retreated to the cabin, not daring to look back. I had broken another unspoken rule. Grant them the dignity of the exchange. Do not watch. The rock was the neutral ground, and it had to be respected as such. I spent the rest of the night feeling its gaze on my cabin, a heavy, patient presence that I had foolishly disrespected. I had shown curiosity, and in this world, that was a dangerous, aggressive act. The pact was fragile, and I had just tested its limits. To my immense relief, the offering was taken. In its place was something that defied all explanation. It was a single, large feather, but it was pure white, glistening under the morning sun. It looked like a shard of frozen light, a raven's feather, by its size and shape, but ravens here are the color of coal, an albino raven, at this altitude. The chances were infinitesimally small. It was a near impossibility. This gift felt different. It was more personal. The stone and the fossil were of the earth. This was from the sky. It was a thing of beauty, of impossible rarity. I held it in my hand, the barbs soft as silk. And I felt like I was holding a paradox. Was it a symbol? A message about being different, about being unique in a harsh world? Or was it simply the most beautiful thing it had to find that day? I realized I was starting to think of it as a person, assigning intent and poetry to its actions. The line between observer and participant had completely vanished. The winter deepened, and the ritual became the rhythm of my life, the engine that drove my days. Checking my gauges, chopping wood, melting snow for water, these were now just the things I did between exchanges. I found myself rationing my own food more strictly, a little less rice here, a little less tea there, so that I would have more to offer. My life, once a static existence of penance and waiting, now had a purpose. It was a strange, secret purpose that filled me with a quiet, humming excitement and a constant, low-level dread. Prepare the offering at dusk. Place it on the border stone. Retreat into my own world. Sleep, a fitful, dreaming sleep. Then, at dawn, the discovery, the analysis, the entry in the logbook, the wait for the next night. It was an addiction. Each gift was a clue, a micro-revelation that only deepened the central mystery. I was the sole audience to the most profound conversation on the planet, and it was happening without a single word being spoken. My observation of them changed, too. I no longer saw them as just a subject of study. I began to see the dynamics of their family. Through my spotting scope, from the safe distance of my cabin window, I watched the adult teach the young ones. I saw it show them how to use its long, powerful fingers to dig for a specific type of lichen that grew under the snow on south-facing rocks. I watched it lead them to the edge of a ridge and make them sit, showing them how the wind created plumes of snow that signaled an unstable cornice, a death trap of overhanging snow waiting to collapse. It was a classroom in the clouds, a transfer of knowledge that was millions of years old. The parent was patient, guiding the little ones with nudges of its massive head, correcting their clumsy attempts with a quiet authority. It was a display of parenting as raw and fundamental as anything I had ever seen. The young ones had distinct personalities. I started thinking of them as the bold one and the cautious one. The bold one was always first to tumble into a new snowdrift, to investigate a strange rock formation, its movements jerky and full of a boisterous energy. The cautious one hung back, watching its sibling, watching the parent, its movements more measured and deliberate. They played. I watched them for hours as they engaged in mock fights. Rolling and grappling in the deep powder, their high-pitched, breathy squeaks barely audible on the wind. Their play was a strange, beautiful dance, a mix of primate wrestling and the powerful lunges of a bear. Seeing them play, seeing that simple, uncomplicated joy in a landscape so defined by death and survival, was profoundly moving. It solidified the truth in my gut. These were not monsters, they were people. Of a different kind, perhaps, but they felt, they learned, and they loved. I started to notice the rules of their world, the invisible lines they would not cross. There was a particular jagged peak to the west of my cabin, a spire of black rock that was constantly scoured by the wind. They gave this peak an unnervingly wide berth. Even when it offered the most direct path to a foraging ground, the adult would lead the young ones on a long, circuitous route to avoid its shadow. I scanned the peak with my scope for days, looking for a reason. Was there a predator's den there? A snow leopard, perhaps? Unlikely to trouble the adult. Was the terrain more treacherous than it looked? I couldn't see anything. The western peak was forbidden. It was a law in their geography, a place of danger or perhaps of reverence, a taboo I could only observe but not understand. It was a stark reminder that as much as I was learning, their world was infinitely more complex than mine, governed by rules I would never know. Then came the new sound. It wasn't the guttural chuffing of reassurance or the playful squeaks of the young. This was different. It happened only at twilight, when the sun had vanished and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The adult would stand facing the vast, empty expanse of the Khumbu Glacier, and it would emit a low, resonant hum. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, even from a mile away. It was not a call to its young. It was something else, a lament, a prayer. It would hold a note for a full minute, a perfect, steady frequency that seemed to make the very air tremble. Then, silence. It was a ritual of their own, something that had nothing to do with me or our exchange. It was a sound filled with a sense of immense distance and longing. It was the sound of waiting. I would stand at my window, listening, and feel an echo of that same desolate patience in my own heart. The pact was not without its price. My careful winter rationing was in shambles. I was giving them a significant portion of my highest calorie food, and my own body was starting to protest. I felt a constant, gnawing hunger. I was losing weight, and the cold seemed to bite deeper than in years past. I knew I would have to make a trip down to a lower supply cache. I maintained for emergencies a small, hidden store of food 5 miles down the mountain. It was a risky journey. A sudden storm, a misstep on an icy ledger. Dozen things could go wrong. But the thought of stopping the exchanges was unbearable. The risk to myself seemed small compared to the risk of breaking the connection, of silencing the conversation. The ritual demanded sacrifice, and I was willing to pay. My penance on this mountain was no longer about a past mistake. It was now about a present duty. The family needed me. One evening, as the light began to fail, I was preparing my nightly offering when I looked up and saw the adult creature, closer than ever before. It was not at the hollow, not on the far ridges. It was sitting on a ledge of rock directly across the clearing, perhaps 200 yards away. It wasn't moving towards the exchange rock. It was simply sitting there, motionless, its great, shaggy form a stoic statue against the fading sky. It was watching my cabin, its breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a small, temporary cloud. There was no menace in its posture, only a calm, patient observation. For the first time, I felt truly seen. It was no longer just me, the secret observer in my lonely outpost. The roles had been reversed. It was watching me. It knew where I was. It knew who was leaving the gifts. And in that silent, shared moment of mutual regard, the pact was sealed, not as a trade, but as a trust. The exchanges evolved, growing more complex, more intimate. One morning, after leaving a precious bar of Swiss chocolate with almonds, I found something that made the air freeze in my lungs. Lying on the rock was my old, steel-handled ice axe. Not a copy, but mine. I had lost it to winters prior, during a sudden whiteout on the western slope. A costly mistake that had almost trapped me overnight. I'd presumed it was buried under 100 feet of snow, gone forever. And here it was, returned. Not just found, but presented. The message was chillingly clear. Asterisk, we have been watching you for a very long time. We know your paths. We know your mistakes. Asterisk, my role as the secret observer was a fiction I had told myself. The truth was, we had been observing each other all along. The mountain wasn't just my prison. It was our shared territory, and they knew its every secret, including my own. The gift was a gesture of trust, but it was also a quiet display of their superior knowledge of this place. The young ones grew bolder. The one I called the bold one, fueled by a relentless curiosity, began to test the boundaries we had silently established. One afternoon, I saw it creep away from its parent, making its way, slowly, cautiously, towards the clearing. Not towards the rock, but towards my cabin. It moved from boulder to boulder, a small grey-white shadow against the snow, its dark eyes fixed on my window. My heart pounded. This was a violation, a dangerous one. Before I could even react, the adult materialized, as if from the very air, moving with a speed that defied its bulk. It didn't make a sound. It simply placed itself between the young one and my cabin. A living wall. It lowered its great head and nudged the smaller creature firmly, steering it back towards the hollow. A silent reprimand, a lesson in the rules that kept them alive. The parent understood a truth I was just beginning to grasp. Proximity was danger. I felt a surge of responsibility that was almost paternal. They were not just a curiosity. They were under my care, in a way. I decided my next offering had to be more than just sustenance. It had to be about comfort, a concept I wasn't even sure they could understand. That night, I took an old, thick wool blanket from my footlocker. It smelled of cedar and disuse, but it was warm and heavy. The thought of them huddling for warmth in the bitter wind, of the young ones shivering, was something I couldn't bear. Leaving it on the rock felt different. It was an offering, not for the body, but for the act of living itself. It was a gesture of pure empathy. A message sent from one creature who knew the cold to another. I was breaking my own scientific detachment into 1,000 pieces, and I didn't care. I was acting not as a climatologist, but as a neighbor. A strange, solitary neighbor in a world of two families. The blanket was gone by morning. The gift left in its place marked a profound shift in our conversation. It was not a stone, a fossil, or a feather. It was a small, tightly woven mat. I brought it inside, my hands shaking. It was made from different types of lichen, dried grasses, and thin, flexible twigs from the dwarf junipers that grew near the glacier. It was intricate, a clear work of craft. The colors were arranged in a subtle pattern, greens and grays and yellows, spiraling inward. It was an artifact, a piece of their culture. They had taken my offering of manufactured warmth and responded with an object of their own making, a symbol of their own methods of creating shelter and comfort. This was not a gift from the mountain. It was a gift from their hands. It was the most human thing I had ever seen. The gulf between our species felt, for a moment, infinitesimally small. I had offered comfort, and they had replied, we, too, understand this need. Then, the world below intruded. It began with a sound that tore the silence to shreds. A deep, guttural hump that echoed unnaturally off the high peaks. A helicopter, not the slow, lumbering transport craft I occasionally saw in the far distance, but something sleek, fast, and garish orange. It swooped low into the valley below my cabin, a mechanical predator in this pristine wilderness. My stomach tightened into a cold knot. Helicopters meant people, and people up here, in this unsanctioned territory, meant trouble. They were a random variable, a chaotic force in the carefully balanced equation of my existence. I watched through my scope as it deposited a group of figures onto a high, untouched slope. Their brightly colored ski gear looked like a toxic spill against the pure white of the snow. They were a violation, a noisy, arrogant stain on the landscape. Their presence was an assault on the senses. The thin air, which usually carried only the sound of wind and ice, was now polluted with their shouts and whoops of excitement. At night, I could hear the faint, tinny thud of electronic music coming from their camp in the lower valley. It was a sound so alien, so utterly wrong in this place, that it felt like a physical pain. They were heliskiers, wealthy thrill-seekers, buying their way to untouched powder, treating the sacred heights of Sagarmatha as their personal playground. They had no idea of the delicate ecosystem they were disrupting, not the biological one, but the secret, silent one that existed between my cabin and the hollow. The family, of course, had vanished. The first night the helicopter arrived, the exchange rock was bare. The silence from their side of the mountain was absolute, a new kind of silence filled with fear. I felt a rage I hadn't experienced in years, a hot, protective anger. These were my mountains. This was my solitude. And more importantly, this was their asterisk home. These loud, careless people with their money and their machines were trespassing in a kingdom they couldn't even perceive. Every laugh that drifted up on the wind felt like a threat. Every new set of ski tracks scarring the slopes was a potential line of discovery. I found myself obsessively scanning the ridges, not for the family, but for the skiers, tracking their movements, praying they would stay low. My quiet life of observation had become a tense vigil. I was a sentry on the wall of a secret garden, and the barbarians were at the gate, entirely unaware that the gate even existed. My penance had become a guardianship, and the weight of it was crushing. For 3 days, the family remained hidden. The rock was empty each morning, a stark reminder of the broken trust, the broken rhythm. The joy and purpose that the ritual had given me was replaced by a hollow anxiety. I missed them. I missed the quiet conversation, the morning mystery. I felt their absence as a physical ache. The skiers were a blight, and their presence had poisoned the fragile peace I had cultivated. I found myself whispering curses at them, my breath fogging the window pane of my scope. "Go home," I'd mutter. "Just go home." On the 4th day, they seemed to be packing up their camp. I felt a surge of relief, but my relief was premature. One of them had a new toy they wanted to try out first. A final, technological violation that would bring my two worlds into a catastrophic collision. It started as a faint, high-pitched buzz, like a trapped insect, but the sound grew steadily louder, more persistent. I scanned the sky, my eyes straining against the glare of the snow, and then I saw it. A small, dark drone, a quadcopter, lifting off from the skiers' camp below. It rose quickly, a malevolent hornet against the brilliant blue sky. My blood ran cold. Drones have cameras. They have thermal imaging. They are the perfect tool for exploring inaccessible places, for seeing what is meant to remain unseen. It was a toy for the rich, a way to get some spectacular footage for their vacation videos. But up here, it was an instrument of discovery, an unblinking, technologically perfect eye that was about to stumble upon a secret that had been kept for half a century. And I was the only one who could see it coming. My relief turned to raw panic. The drone wasn't just flying randomly. It was ascending steadily, making a beeline for the western ridges. It was flying directly towards the hidden hollow where the family sheltered. I watched through my scope, a helpless observer to an imminent disaster. I could almost feel the creature's terror, their confusion at this buzzing alien intruder. Would they run? Would they hide? Or would the adult, in a desperate act of protection, try to attack it? Either way, they would be seen, recorded, the mystery would be over, replaced by a global media frenzy. Helicopters would swarm this place. Scientists, soldiers, hunters, the family would be captured or killed. Their world and mine would be shattered forever. Time seemed to slow down. I had to do something. I had seconds to make a choice. My mind raced. A flare gun. It would just draw attention, go outside and yell. Futile. The answer came to me in a flash of desperate inspiration. My radio. My powerful old shortwave radio. A relic I used maybe twice a year to listen to weather reports from Kathmandu. It was capable of broadcasting, not just receiving. Its signal was strong, designed to cut through atmospheric interference in the high mountains. Jamming, that was the only way. It was a 1 in a million shot, but it was the only shot I had. I lunged for the radio, my hands clumsy with adrenaline. I flipped the power switch, ignoring the warm-up time, and cranked the dial across the frequencies, pushing the transmission button. A chaotic blast of static, a wall of meaningless electronic noise, erupted from my antenna, flooding the valley with an invisible, chaotic storm. Through the scope, I saw the drone falter. Its steady, purposeful flight became erratic. It wobbled, then spun, its rotors fighting for control against a signal they couldn't understand. The skiers would blame it on magnetic interference from mineral deposits in the rock, a common phenomenon in the Himalayas. But I knew the truth. My desperate act had worked. The drone tilted, went into a flat spin, and crashed into a deep snowdrift on the far side of the ridge, well away from the hollow. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over me, so strong it made my knees buckle. I had done it. I had protected them. But the relief was instantly chased by a new and terrifying thought. I had just broadcast a powerful, unauthorized, wideband signal from an unregistered location. I had saved my family from the curious tourists. But I had just lit a massive flare for anyone else who might be listening. The silence that returned after the skiers finally left was heavier than before. It was a silence filled with consequence. I had taken a colossal risk, and now I had to wait to see what the cost would be. That night, I went to the exchange rock, my heart full of dread and hope. I left a double ration of food, an apology, and a celebration in one. The next morning, it was gone. In its place was a piece of twisted black plastic and metal. I recognized it instantly. It was a fragment from the propeller arm of the crashed drone. The message was unambiguous. Asterisk, we saw what you did. We understand. Asterisk, this wasn't a gift from the mountain. It wasn't a symbol of nature. It was a piece of the threat I had neutralized. It was a thank you. It was proof that we were no longer just neighbors. We were allies, and our fates were now irrevocably intertwined. I held the sharp piece of plastic in my hand and felt the true weight of my actions. Every gift has a price. I had deepened my bond with them, cemented our pact in a way I never could have imagined. I had become their protector. But in doing so, I had turned my secret hiding place into a beacon. I had traded the small, immediate threat of a few careless humans for a much larger, more sophisticated, and unknown danger. Somewhere in a quiet listening station, an analyst might be looking at a map, circling an area in the high Himalayas, where a sudden, powerful burst of radio noise had appeared and then vanished. My desperate act of protection was also an act of exposure. The quiet war for this mountain had just escalated, and I had a terrible feeling that the next visitors wouldn't be so easy to scare away. The change came with the Great Whiteout. It's a term we use up here for a multi-day, zero visibility blizzard that buries the world under a mountain of fresh powder. The forecast models I still run gave me 12 hours notice, but nothing can truly prepare you for it. The wind arrived first, a low moan that escalated into a full-throated shriek, a sound of fury that seemed to want to peel the iron roof from my cabin. Then the snow, not falling but driven horizontally, a solid wall of white that erased the world. For 5 days, I was a man buried alive. The only sounds were the scream of the wind and the groaning protest of the cabin's timbers. I couldn't see the exchange rock. I couldn't see the mountains. I couldn't see anything. In that sensory deprivation tank, my imagination ran wild. I pictured them huddled in their hollow, the young ones shivering, the adult a living bulwark against the storm. The ritual was broken, the connection severed by the raw power of the climate I once studied so dispassionately. The mountain was reminding me who was truly in charge. When the storm finally broke, the silence was more profound than the noise had been. I opened my door to a world reborn, sculpted into impossible new shapes. The snow was 30 feet deep in the drifts, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. My first act, after clearing the doorway, was to go to the spotting scope. My hands were shaking, my breath fogging the glass. The clearing was a pristine, untouched blanket of white, and there, standing by the no-buried exchange rock, was the adult. It was alone. It stood perfectly still, a grey statue against the blinding snow. I felt a surge of relief that it had survived, but the relief was immediately soured by a cold dread. Where were the children? My eyes scanned every hollow, every shadow, every drift. Nothing. The landscape was beautiful and terrifyingly empty. There was only the one solitary figure, waiting. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me more than the air that something was terribly wrong. I had never seen it so still, so patient, so utterly alone. I quickly bundled an offering the best I had, a whole tin of smoked oysters and 2 bars of chocolate. I put on my snowshoes and made the arduous trip to the rock, the new snow so deep it felt like wading through sand. I placed the food on the one patch of stone the wind had kept clear. The adult watched me, but it didn't react. It just stood there, its great head lowered slightly. I retreated to the cabin and watched through the scope, expecting it to approach the food. It didn't move. It simply stood its ground for an hour, and then another. As the sun began to dip, casting long blue shadows, it did something I will never forget. It turned its head, not towards me, but towards a massive snowdrift near the tree line to the east. It lifted its head to the sky and let out a sound. It wasn't the hum of twilight, nor the chuff of reassurance. It was a low, guttural moan of pure, undiluted grief. A sound of loss so profound it seemed to shake the very glass in my window and vibrate deep inside my own chest. That sound broke me. I have heard the sound of glaciers calving, of rockfalls thundering down a mountainside. I know the sounds of power and destruction. This was different. This was the sound of a broken heart. In that moment, it was not a creature, not a cryptid. It was a parent who had lost a child. All my rules, all my scientific detachment, all my fear, it all evaporated. There was only that sound and the terrible image it conjured. I broke the last and most sacred rule. Not just leaving food, not just jamming a signal. I broke the rule of separation. I geared up, grabbing my emergency pack with the small handsaw and my first aid kit. My mind was eerily calm, focused on a single purpose. I followed its gaze. I was going to the eastern tree line. I was crossing the boundary. I was entering their world not as an observer, not as a provider, but as an intruder, acting on a shared, terrible grief. The adult watched me go, its dark eyes following my every step. It did not try to stop me. It simply watched. The snow was loose and deep, and every step was a battle. I followed the path of its gaze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached the tree line and saw it immediately. The cause of the drift, a great fir tree, heavy with the weight of the new snow, had snapped near its base and fallen. Its upper branches were buried in the drift, creating a deep, shadowed hollow. And from that hollow, I saw a flicker of movement. And then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whimper of pain. Pushing through the snow-laden branches, I found it. It was the cautious one. It was alive, but barely. Its left leg was pinned beneath the massive trunk of the fallen tree, twisted at an unnatural angle. Its fur was matted with frozen sweat, and its eyes were half closed, clouded with pain and exhaustion. It was shivering violently, its small body radiating a desperate, fading warmth into the crushing cold. The sight was horrific, a nightmare of splintered wood and broken life. I dropped to my knees in the snow, my mind racing. The young one let out another weak cry as I got closer. I looked back across the clearing. The adult was still there, a sentinel of grief, watching. It was bigger and more powerful than me in every conceivable way. It could have crossed the clearing in seconds and torn me apart for approaching its injured child, but it didn't. It stood its ground. Its posture a taut wire of tension and despair. And in its stillness, I understood. This was a plea. This was an act of absolute, desperate trust. It had shown me the problem because it was incapable of fixing it. Its strength was useless against the crushing weight of the tree. It needed my hands, my tools, my knowledge. The silence between us was filled with an unspoken agreement. A bridge of trust was being extended across an impossible divide, forged in a crucible of shared fear for the small, broken life in the snow. My training, what little I had from wilderness survival courses decades ago, kicked in. "Okay," I whispered, to the creature, to myself. "Okay, we can do this." I pulled the small, foldable saw from my pack. The sound of its teeth biting into the frozen wood was loud in the silence. All the while, the adult watched. Its dark, intelligent eyes never left me. It wasn't a look of menace, but of intense, focused scrutiny. It was judging me, my every action. I worked frantically, my muscles screaming in the thin air, sawing through the section of trunk that pinned the young one's leg. It took an eternity. The cautious one shivered and cried out, but it didn't struggle against me. It seemed to understand, on some primal level, that I was trying to help. Finally, with a loud crack, the section of wood gave way. I carefully, gently, pulled the massive weight off the limb. The leg was bad. A crude break, the bone clearly misaligned. I worked quickly, my fingers growing numb despite my gloves. I took out my first aid kit. It wasn't much, some bandages, antiseptic wipes, and 2 lightweight aluminum splints I carried for my own potential injuries. I cleaned the area as best I could, talking in a low, soothing voice the entire time. The same voice I used to use when my own daughter would fall and scrape her knee. I gently straightened the limb, earning a sharp cry of pain that lanced through me. And then I strapped the splints tightly, immobilizing the break. I wrapped the whole leg in the last of my clean bandages. It was a crude, clumsy field dressing, but it was the best I could do. The young one was weak, exhausted, but its breathing was steadier. I took off my own outer parka and draped it over the small, shivering body. And then, there was nothing left to do. I had done all I could. I looked up, exhausted, and met the gaze of the parent across the snow. For 2 days, I kept a vigil from my window. The adult moved the injured young one into the shelter of the hollow. I saw the bold one nuzzling its sibling, bringing it mouthfuls of snow to eat. The parent never strayed far, a constant, watchful presence. It took the food I left now, large quantities of it, and I knew it was for the injured child. On the 3rd morning, the cautious one took a few tentative, hopping steps. Its splinted leg held off the ground. It was healing. The wave of relief that washed over me was dizzying. That evening, as twilight fell, the adult did something new. It walked to the edge of the clearing and looked back at my cabin. It waited. When I stepped outside, it turned and began to walk. Not towards the Exchange Rock, but south, towards the vast, groaning face of the Khumbu Glacier. It was an invitation, a summons. I followed, my heart pounding with a new kind of anticipation. The rescue was over. The reward was about to begin. It led me to a place I had never been, to a freshly exposed wall of ancient blue ice revealed by a landslide during the blizzard. The glacier here was different, older. The ice was clear as glass and radiated a cold that felt like it came from the dawn of time. The adult creature stopped before this wall of ice. It looked at me, then at the ice, then back at me. Then it slowly raised its massive 5-fingered hand and pressed it flat against the glacial face. It held it there, a dark shape against the luminous blue, and that's when I saw them. Frozen deep within the ice, perfectly preserved, were other shapes. They were not rocks. They were not bones. They were dark, metallic, and geometric. Twisted spars of metal, curved plates of a material I didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that spoke of design, of engineering. It was like looking at the skeletal ribs of a wrecked ship. A ship that had wrecked 1,000 years ago and been swallowed by the ice. The sky was watching, and I finally understood. This wasn't just a family hiding. This was a vigil. The hike back to my cabin was a blur. The secret I carried was no longer just about the existence of a creature. It was about the origin. The artifact my mentor found, the one that ruined him, wasn't a meteorite. It was a piece of this. The strange hum at twilight wasn't a lament. It was a call. They weren't from here. They weren't hiding from us. They were waiting. They were survivors of a crash, stranded for generations in the harshest environment on the planet. Their story frozen in the heart of the glacier. The gifts of stone and fossil were not just a language. They were a history lesson. Pieces of the world they had been forced to adopt. My act of kindness, of setting a broken bone, had been repaid with the greatest secret in human history. The weight of it settled on me, a pressure greater than any glacier. I was no longer a keeper of a secret. I was a custodian of a truth that could change everything. If this story is changing something in you, if you feel the weight of this secret as I did, please, show your support. This journey is getting more dangerous with every step. Hit the like button, subscribe to be the first to hear what comes next, and share this confession with someone who understands the importance of listening. You need to know what happens when the outside world, the one with the high-tech listening posts, finally responds to my signal. Because they are coming. And the truth I just learned is exactly what they're looking for. Stay with me. The worst is yet to come. The quiet lasted for a week. A nervous, fragile quiet where I half expected the skiers to return. Instead, something far worse arrived. It wasn't the clumsy thunder of a transport chopper. It was the sharp, slicing beat of a modern military-style helicopter. A sleek, unmarked bell, painted a dull, non-reflective grey that absorbed the harsh mountain light. It didn't land near the old heliskiing spot. It set down with unnerving precision on a flat saddle a mile from my cabin, a location shielded from view from the lower valleys. I watched through my scope as men in practical dark gear disembarked and began setting up a camp. It was a web of camouflaged tents and bristling antennae, erected with a silent, methodical efficiency that spoke of extensive training. The first thing I felt was a cold certainty. They were here because of me. The radio broadcast, the exchange rock, which had been a symbol of our connection, now felt like a spotlight, a terrible vulnerability. The conversation was over. The silence that fell was no longer about peace. It was about fear. The next day, a figure detached from the camp and began making its way towards my cabin. He moved with an easy, ground-eating stride, using snowshoes with the familiarity of a man who spent his life in difficult terrain. He was alone, which was meant to be disarming, but was somehow more threatening. When he reached my door, he didn't knock loudly, just a firm, polite rapping. I opened it to a man in his late 40s, his face weathered by wind and sun, but his eyes were sharp and analytical. They were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He introduced himself as Mr. Cole, the leader of a glaciological survey team from a government research agency I'd never heard of. He said they were here to study the accelerated melt patterns on the Khumbu. It was a perfect lie, plausible and professional. I invited him in for tea, my mind screaming. My hands were steady as I poured the water, a performance of normalcy that felt like the most difficult acting of my life. I was a specimen under his microscope. We spoke about the weather, about the history of my station, about the lie of my academic past, which I was sure he already knew inside and out. I played the part of the reclusive, slightly eccentric academic, content in my isolation. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over my equipment, my logbooks, the small fossilized trilobite sitting on my mantelpiece. Then, with the casual air of a man asking for the time, he changed the subject. We detected some unusual atmospheric phenomena in this sector recently, he said, stirring his tea. Specifically, a powerful wideband radio burst on a clear day about a week and a half ago. Very anomalous. You wouldn't have noticed anything, would you? Any equipment malfunctions, strange static. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. The air in the cabin was suddenly thin as a razor's edge. I had to lie to a man who lived by detecting lies. I forced a small laugh. The static is my constant companion up here, Mr. Cole. I wouldn't know an anomaly from a Tuesday. His smile didn't reach his eyes, of course, just routine questions. He left soon after, a polite departure that felt like a tactical withdrawal. The real surveillance began that night. My paranoia was not paranoia, it was observation. Through my scope, I saw them. Small, dark shapes lifting off from their camp, moving silently against the star-dusted sky. Drones, not the clumsy toy the skiers had, but advanced, military-grade thermal imaging units. They began a methodical sweep of the ridges, flying in a precise grid pattern. I watched in absolute horror as one of them flew directly over the hollow where the family sheltered. I could picture the screen in Cole's command tent, the heat signatures of the creatures lighting up like flares. 3 distinct bodies, where there should be only cold rock. The pact was shattered. I could never go to the exchange rock again. I couldn't even look in their direction for fear of my gaze leading an invisible gun to their heads. My cabin, my sanctuary, had become the center of a closing trap. My isolation, once a source of peace, curdled into annoying paranoia. Every creak of the cabin's frame in the wind was one of Cole's men on my roof. Every shadow that flickered at the edge of my vision was a soldier in camouflage. The silence I once cherished was now filled with imagined transmissions, with the hum of electronics, with the sound of my own frantic pulse. I started checking my own cabin for listening devices, running my hands along the wooden beams, tapping walls, feeling an invasive presence in my most private space. I stopped writing in my logbook, convinced they could somehow read the vibrations of my pen on the page. I was a prisoner in my own home, and the wardens were a team of silent, efficient ghosts with technology I couldn't comprehend. My act of protection had doomed them. I had saved them from a tourist's camera, only to deliver them into the hands of a government that would see them not as a family, but as an asset, a weapon, a thing to be vivisected and owned. The guilt was a physical weight. For 3 days, there was no sign of the family. The exchange rock was a tombstone under the snow. I feared they had fled, or worse, been captured in the night. Then, on the 4th morning, there was something there. Not on the rock itself, but stabbed into the snowdrift beside it. It was a single, long piece of wood, a branch from a dwarf juniper, and it had been sharpened to a spear-like point. It was aimed directly at the camouflaged camp on the saddle. The message was stark, primal, and terrifyingly clear. Asterisk, we see them. We know the danger. Asterisk, it was not a gift. It was a warning. A declaration of war from a party that had no chance of winning. The adult was communicating with me one last time, not with a symbol of our connection, but with a symbol of the new and deadly threat that stood between us. They were not running. They were standing their ground, and my heart broke knowing that their courage was futile. Their world had shrunk to a single hollow, and now that too was under siege by an enemy they could see but not fight. The next day, Cole returned. The pretense of politeness was gone. He stood in my doorway and didn't wait for an invitation. His eyes were hard. "I've been reading your file, Dr. Thorne," he began, his voice flat. "It makes for interesting reading. Falsifying data, a disgraced mentor obsessed with anomalous artifacts from this very region. A man with your history, choosing to live in complete isolation for 20 years. A cynic might think you are hiding something, or perhaps waiting for something." The threat was no longer veiled. He was attacking my credibility, my history, using the very lie that exiled me here as a weapon against me. He was telling me that he knew I was compromised, that my word was worthless, that I was a cornered man with no one to call for help. He was isolating me psychologically, just as his team was isolating me physically. He suspected I wasn't just a witness. He suspected I was a participant, a collaborator with whatever was out on that ice. And he was right. His team escalated their operations. They were no longer trying to be subtle. I watched as they set up a perimeter of what looked like seismic sensors around my clearing. Small spikes they drove into the snow and rock. They deployed atmospheric samplers on high poles, their small fans worry faintly on the wind. They were mapping my world, my territory, with a cold, scientific brutality. They were listening to the footsteps of the mountain itself, waiting for a tremor that didn't match the geology. They were tasting the air, searching for biological signatures that didn't belong. The western peak, the one the family always avoided, was now home to a large dish antenna, pointed not at the sky, but down, at the ground. They were using ground-penetrating radar. They were searching for the wreckage. They were no longer just looking for the family. They were looking for their ship. The methodical process was terrifying, a slow-motion dissection of my entire reality. On his final visit, Cole laid his cards on the table. He found me outside, chopping wood, my breath misting in the frigid air. He stood there for a moment, watching me, his hands in his pockets. "We're not here for the ice, Aris," he said, using my first name for the first time. "We're here to secure a unique biological and technological asset, a non-terrestrial one. Something my predecessors have been tracking for 50 years, since your mentor first stumbled upon it. We believe it's been using this valley as a refuge, and we believe you've been acting as its local point of contact." He paused, his gaze locking onto mine. "Whatever it is, it belongs to us. It's a matter of national security. You can either be the man who helps his country secure the most important discovery in human history, or you can be the man who tried to hide it. There is no third option." He wasn't asking for my help. He was informing me of my role. I was the key, and he was about to turn me in the lock. The end came into focus that night. The dread I'd been living with sharpened into a single point of terrible clarity. I was sweeping my shortwave radio across the bands, a desperate habit, listening for anything. I caught it by accident. A short, encrypted burst transmission from Cole's camp, but a few words were clear through the digital hash. Sweep at dawn, grid 7. Non-lethal capture protocol authorized for Alpha. Secure, juveniles, grid 7. That was the hollow, Alpha. That was the parent. The juveniles. My heart stopped. They were going in, at first light. The scientific survey was a lie. The patient observation was over. This was a military operation. A kidnapping sanctioned by the state. Time had run out. I looked out the window at the silent, snow-covered mountains, at the distant, menacing outline of Cole's camp. My choice was simple and impossible. I could do nothing and listen to the sounds of a family being torn apart at dawn. Or I could burn my entire world to the ground to give them one last chance to escape the noise. I walked out of my cabin for the last time with the calm of a dead man. The air was achingly cold. The sky, a black velvet cloth punctured by the diamond-sharp light of a million stars. I knew what the headlights on the ridge meant. I knew what sweep at dawn meant. My options had been stripped away, one by one, until only this remained. I wasn't going to the rock. The rock was a symbol of a conversation that was over. I moved silently, a shadow among shadows, skirting the perimeter of seismic sensors whose faint red lights blinked like malevolent eyes in the dark. I was heading for the hollow. I was going to them. This was no longer about observation or even protection. This was about bearing witness to the end, or perhaps trying to change its final sentence. Every footstep in the snow felt like a betrayal of the life I once had, and a final, desperate step towards a truth I was no longer sure I could carry. The quiet was absolute, the kind of stillness that precedes an avalanche. They were there, huddled together, not in fear, but with a profound and solemn stillness. The young ones were quiet, pressed against the massive form of the parent. As I approached, the adult turned its great head, and in its dark, intelligent eyes, I saw not alarm, but recognition, and acceptance. It knew why I was there. It knew the time had come. I had brought a last offering of food, a foolish, human gesture that felt absurd the moment I thought of it. The adult ignored it completely. It took a single step forward, its immense weight making no sound in the deep powder. It reached into a fold of its own thick fur, and then extended its hand. It didn't offer me a stone or a fossil. It opened its palm, and resting there was a piece of dark, twisted metal, no bigger than my fist. It was not cold. A faint warmth radiated from it, and a barely perceptible hum vibrated in the air around it, a sound I felt in my teeth. The world stopped. My blood ran cold, then hot. The metal was identical to the fragments of the anomalous meteorite my mentor Alistair had found 50 years ago, the artifact that destroyed his career, the event that had, by a long and painful path, led me here. In that instant, the lie I told to protect him was recast, not as a mistake, but as an irony. He had been telling the truth, the ridicule, the shame, my exile. It wasn't a punishment. It was a pilgrimage I didn't know I was on. This cabin, his cabin, was not a prison. It was a listening post he had left for me. My entire life, my failure, my isolation, it all snapped into a new and terrible focus. I wasn't a random observer who stumbled upon a secret. I was the inheritor of a vigil. A man who had spent 20 years running from a destiny that had been waiting for him all along, patient as the ice itself. The weight of that revelation was crushing. The creature closed its hand around the artifact, a silent confirmation. Then, it did something that shattered the last vestiges of my scientific understanding. It slowly, deliberately raised its other arm and pointed. Its long, grey finger aimed not at the menacing camp on the ridge, not at my cabin, but up. Up into the infinite black. It pointed past the familiar constellations, past the planets, to a single, unwavering point of light in the constellation of Lyra. A star that did not twinkle. A fixed point of impossible brightness. A destination. Then it lowered its arm and pointed to the two young ones, huddled and watching. The gesture was a sentence, a story told in a single, silent motion. Asterisk, home, family. The reason, asterisk, they weren't just surviving here. They were trying to get back. The scale of their plight expanded from a mountain to a galaxy. They were castaways, and the Earth was not their sanctuary. It was their island prison. And then came the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The truth that explained everything. The adult looked directly at me, its ancient eyes seeming to peer into the core of my soul. It opened its mouth. I braced for a roar, a hum, some sound of nature I had heard before. Instead, what came out was a perfect, chilling replication of the chaotic, wideband static I had broadcast from my shortwave radio. Sound of chaotic, multi-frequency static, sharp and loud, then cut to silence. It was the sound that had saved them from the drone, the sound of human noise. And I finally, horribly, understood. Our world was not a threat because of our hunters or our armies. We were a threat because of our noise. Their ship was wrecked, but their distress call, a signal they had been broadcasting for generations, was still active. They weren't hiding from us. They were screaming for help, and our entire civilization was a planetary storm of meaningless electronic chatter, drowning them out. We weren't a predator. We were just too loud to hear them die. As if on cue, a line of powerful headlights crested the ridge. The Cole's team, moving for the dawn sweep. The invasion was beginning. The creature looked at the approaching lights, a line of cold white eyes in the darkness, and then looked back at me. There was no plea, no fear in its gaze. Only a deep, profound weariness. It had given me the truth. It had shown me the lock, the key, and the cage. The rest was up to me. And in that moment, I knew what my final offering had to be. Not food for their bodies. Not a blanket for their warmth. I had to give them the one thing they needed more than anything. The one thing I had in abundance up here. Silence and time. I had to make a sound so loud it would deafen Cole to their existence. Just for a few precious hours. I gave the parent a single, slow nod. A promise. Then I turned and walked away from the hollow for the last time. My steps back to the cabin were light. My purpose absolute. I was no longer a scientist or a hermit. I was a saboteur. I didn't bother to gather my research. My data logs spanning 2 decades. They were the most important part of the plan. I found the large canisters of kerosene I kept for the generator. I began to methodically, almost reverently, douse my entire life. I splashed it over the logbooks, filled with my secret handwriting, the pages describing the riverstone, the fossil, the white feather. I poured it over the cot where I'd had nightmares of my past life. I soaked the chair by the window where I had watched a myth become a family. Each splash was an erasure. I was burning the evidence of my life to protect theirs. This was my true act of penance. Not the passive waiting, but this final, active sacrifice. I was finally answering for my old lie with a new, much greater one. I stood in the doorway, the smell of kerosene sharp and clean in the frigid air. The snowcats were halfway across the saddle now. I could hear the rumble of their engines. I struck a single match. The small flame danced, a tiny star in my hand. I looked towards the hollow one last time and whispered, "Be quiet and run." I tossed the match. The world erupted in a roar of heat and light. The humph of the explosion was my final confession. A fiery signal that would draw every eye, every soldier, every piece of equipment on this mountain to this one spot. They would find the wreckage of my life and a mystery that would occupy them for days. A tragic accident. As the flames clawed at the sky, I slipped out the back and into the deep shadows of the western peak. The one place they never went. The one place Cole's map would show as empty. I moved through the darkness, the roar of my burning past behind me, the sounds of shouting and confusion growing fainter. I was becoming a ghost. Sound of roaring fire fades slowly, replaced by the ambient noise of a crowded, echoing bus station. Distant announcements in a foreign language. Murmur of many people. Hiss of air breaks. My name is not Eris Thorn. That man died in a fire on a mountain in Nepal. I am no one. I am sitting on a hard plastic bench in a border town I cannot name. Watching buses come and go, their diesel fumes filling the air. In my pocket, My fingers traced the outline of a single, smooth, black river stone. I sacrificed my name, my past, my entire existence for a truth I can never speak. I traded my life for theirs, a life I can never again witness. I am a ghost now, lost in the very human noise I helped them escape. If only for a moment, my exile isn't over. It has just expanded to encompass the entire world, and the silence I now carry is heavier than any mountain. My reflection in the dirty bus window is that of a stranger. The ultimate moral of my story is not that we should fear the unknown. It's that we should be terrified of what our own noise makes us deaf to. That our progress, our communication, our constant, screaming broadcast of ourselves into the universe creates a static so profound that we can no longer hear the things that matter. Somewhere, high above the noise of this station, high above the world, a family is still waiting. They are watching a single, silent star, listening for a rescue that may never come. My part in their story is over. I protected their secret. The cost of their survival was my silence, and that is a price I will pay for whatever is left of my life. This story is my final, silent scream into the static. Maybe this time, someone will hear. Thank you for listening to my confession until the very end. If my story meant something to you, if you believe that some secrets are worth keeping, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel for more stories from the edge of our world. Share this with someone who knows how to listen to the silence. And now, I'd ask you to watch the video that is about to be recommended on your screen. Perhaps it holds another story that needs to be heard. I have to go now. My bus is here.